Welcome to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine we put together at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy so that wherever you may find yourself and somebody is spouting some sort of party line, you can come with facts and from an organization that has been in the center square of the body politic in Virginia long enough to remember when the Virginia way actually meant something. Our first guest this week is back with us from the election integrity operations for us, as well as the manager of our election integrity law reform initiative, but also senior legal fellow at the Meese Center for Legal and Judicial Studies at the Heritage Foundation. He is, by now you know, it's Hans von Spakovsky. Good morning, Hans. How are you doing today?
I'm doing okay. I think I need to shorten my title so it doesn't take up so much time.
Well, you need to stop saying yes to so many people when they say, hey, can you help us out with this? That's my problem. It doesn't fit on a business chord. I know there's a couple of municipalities in Virginia that are going to do it, a couple of political parties that are going to do it in their primaries, which I guess is fine for the internal operations of a political primary. But this is the camel's nose under the tent flap, isn't it?
It is. And the thing about it is people at first, I think when they first hear it, they say, oh, yeah, it's a good idea. But once they learn about how it works, folks overwhelmingly reject it and realize it's not a good idea. There are many reasons for that. The most obvious one is it's confusing and chaotic. I mean, it's hard to explain how it works. And also, it's opaque. You know, it's very easy at the end of election night when the votes have been counted in a regular election to figure out who the winner is by who's got the most votes. But that's not the case with ranked choice voting, because they often have to go through multiple rounds of vote counting where they actually change the votes of particular voters, depending on which candidate is left in the race, which candidate's been thrown out, so that it's like I said, it's opaque. And in fact, it's so confusing that just recently, John, I don't know if you saw this, but out in California in a school board race, I think it was Alameda County, several months after the end of the election, after the winner had been certified, county election officials had to admit they made a mistake. They used a ranked choice voting system. They had multiple rounds, and they got it wrong. They certified the person who didn't actually win, and they didn't realize they'd made a mistake. The only way the mistake was found was because an outside group actually audited everything they had done, and then they figured it out. That's how confusing ranked choice voting is.
Is there, and I don't want to be the guy jumping at shadows, but I feel like that is just meant to accelerate our decline in faith in our election system, Hans, because it's already tenuous enough, and you add this on top of it, and we're just going to go home.
Well, yeah, and in fact, that happened in Alaska. Listen, in Alaska, in the November elections, they had ranked choice voting. Really, for the first time, it was put in by a referendum. It just barely passed. Alaska had, I think, one of the lowest turnouts in its entire history. Compare that to other states where turnout was very robust, particularly in places like Georgia. And again, if you don't understand the voting process or how it works, you're not going to want to go vote. And by the way, it produces a lot of disenfranchisement, because if you don't rank every single candidate in a race, in multiple rounds of vote tabulation, your ballot, if you didn't rank all the candidates, will get thrown out. That risk is so bad that in 2021, when they had the New York mayor's race, first time ranked choice voting, it took them 8 rounds of vote counting over 2 weeks before they came up with the winner. And in the final round, the votes of 140,000 New Yorkers weren't counted. They had been thrown out. Why? Well, because those voters didn't rank all the candidates.
It's crazy, especially if you're looking at somebody who you might desperately not want to be there. And I say that having gone to high school with the mayor of New York, and I shake my head over it every time. But there he is in the class of '81, Bayside High School. But that being said, you look at how many people get thrown out, and then you start to talk about the parliamentary procedure of the order in which the each level is done. You talked about people getting thrown out when they shouldn't have been, or the wrong vote was counted at the wrong time because, well, this candidate was out, but then these candidates should have been in. It is rife for fraud on top of it, isn't it? Where really the officials get to just sort of say, yeah, Hans is the winner. Just let's get out of here. Well,
yes. And in fact, back to the New York race and your former high school comrade.
True story.
In fact, there was huge confusion in the New York race when they were counting because election officials, without anybody realizing it, made a mistake and loaded over 100,000 what had been test votes into the calculations for the ranked choice voting, and they had to fix that problem also. Look, this is so bad that even though there's a lot of money on the left, and there's some Republicans who I think mistakenly think it's a good idea, look, even some liberals have come out and said, look, this is not a good idea. Jerry Brown, former governor of California, I don't agree with him on a lot of issues, but he vetoed a bill in California that would have expanded ranked choice voting throughout the state. And when this occurred in New York in that mayor's race, the head of the NAACP in New York, Hazel Dukes, said that this was a confusing, bad way to vote, and she rejected it and said we shouldn't be doing this.
That's the important part, is you point to the bipartisan rancor about ranked choice voting. So who then are the ones who are benefiting from it? Because there has to be somebody who's out there saying this is going to be fun. You mentioned Republicans behind ranked choice voting, and I'm told that this is so that we can win places that we didn't win before. And I'm like, that's no reason to debase the Constitution just so my political party might win some county in California or New York State that they've never won in 100 years.
Well, in fact, that's certainly not what the results have been. It does allow marginal candidates to win, people who are not the first choice, not the second choice, potentially not even the third choice of voters. Mm-hmm. And that's just not the way I think that you should be running elections. So that to me sounds like political consultants putting some kind of short-term gain ahead of honest principles.
No, we would never see that, Hans. No, surely no.
Right.
Hans von Spakovsky is on with us, and he is the manager for the Election Integrity Reform Initiative with us, and trying to make sure that elections are done right. Also with the Mies Center at the Heritage Foundation. Hans, we're talking about ranked choice voting and who it benefits. And you mentioned the consultant class, but you know what I see happening in this, and every place this has happened, is you just wind up with candidate after candidate whose only job is there to dilute the votes of someone else. And as much as I want certain ideological things to happen, I'm a true Russell Kirk fan in the fact that I believe that in a full-throated public airing of ideas, ours are better. But that said, just running to keep somebody else from winning just doesn't seem inspiring, but it seems like what we're getting with this.
No, I think that's exactly right. In fact, several years ago, Christian Adams and I wrote a paper about this. It goes into far more detail about ranked choice voting. And one of the things we pointed out was that if you apply game theory to this, and political consultants no doubt will do this, there are ways to manipulate the system depending on your candidate by telling folks, well, pick this particular person as your second choice or your third choice, because that will help make sure our candidate gets into multiple rounds. And there are ways to do that, to manipulate the system. And that's the way, unfortunately, marginal candidates get elected. And do folks really want people elected who maybe were the first choice of, 35% of the voters? I don't think so. That's not a good idea. And that's whether it doesn't matter whether you're an independent, a libertarian, a Republican, or a Democrat. That's just not a way to get good governance.
Well, we've talked about this frequently on both my local show and on this show, Hans, and I'm sure you and I have talked about this. There's a grander issue, this government of preferential treatment that I need to get to 51% so that my side can benefit from the largesse or the regulation of government. Now with this, you don't even have to get to 51% anymore. So maybe the bigger problem is how government has become so important to everyone's getting by in life.
Yeah, that is a general problem throughout this country, and it's so different. I mean, if you actually look back at our history, government just did not have such control over our lives from birth to death, and it's just not a good thing, because the more regulation you have, the less freedom we have. And while, we need some regulation for safety purposes, we are way far beyond that, too far beyond that.
So that being said, I don't know if it gets any better. The ranked choice voting, actually, though it may sound at its premise like, oh, this will help us because now you only need a third of the population to get to a majority, and then you get whatever the government's handing out that month. But at some point, you're going to wind up with 2/3 of the community unhappy. And I'm not a politician, but I can count two, and that doesn't lead to a very good outcome if 2/3 of your population doesn't feel like they're being listened to.
No, in fact, I think that's why having a 50% plus one requirement to win elections is the right thing to do, because that gives you a mandate for leadership, which if you only have a third of the voters, no one's going to trust or have any faith in what you're doing, and it's not going to have any legitimacy.
Well, look at some of the parliamentary governments that are dear allies of ours. Britain, Israel are two that come into my mind. I think Germany's parliament also, falls into this as well. Where coalition governments come and go, and it seems like they're changing prime ministers every couple of weeks. We used to be the ones that changed our global leaders more frequently than this.
Yeah, that there's a lot of defects to the parliamentary system, but I think part of what is going on here is people wanting to push us in that direction, and that's not a good idea either. Listen, I know we're talking about ranked choice voting, but could I just bring up something else very quickly?
Yeah, no, we got time. I got a whole hour here, so.
If folks haven't seen this, they really need to see it, and that is because we're talking about election reforms. Remember, Georgia passed a whole series of election reforms, including requiring an ID for absentee ballots. And you had folks like Joe Biden saying this was Jim Crow 2.0. People like Stacey Abrams saying, oh, my gosh, this was voter suppression. It would keep black voters from voting. It would cause them all kinds of problems. Well, Joe, a survey was just done, an extensive survey was just done of voters in Georgia by the University of Georgia. So it's not some liberal group, some conservative group. It was the University of Georgia, their Survey Research Center. And they basically asked voters in Georgia about their experience in last year's election. And one of the questions they asked them was, well, in comparison to the 2020 election, was your voting easier, tougher, more difficult? The result was that 19% of black voters said it was easier. 72% said there was no difference, for a total of 91.6%.
Wow.
Almost identical to white voters, who came out at 93.4%. But here's the most startling statistic in this whole thing. they were asked how many black voters had a poor experience voting last year after all these reforms were in place that were supposedly Jim Crow 2.0. 0% of black respondents said they had a poor voting experience.
Wow.
0%. So not a single voter said they had a thing. Oh, also remember, Stacey Abrams kept saying, "Oh, they put in all these things to cause long lines."
Yes.
In Georgia, and again, voters were asked, "How long did you have to wait to vote?" 69% of voters said they didn't have to wait at all or had to wait less than 10 minutes.
Oh, wow. That's
another almost 30% said they only waited between 10 and 30 minutes. So 96% of black voters voted within 30 minutes of getting to a polling place. The comparable number for white voters was a little bit less, 95.2%.
Holy cow.
All of these claims they made were total lies.
Oh, yeah.
And the voting experience of Georgia voters, black and white, shows it.
Is that, and of course, even before they did this research, you saw the voter turnout was way up, the voter engagement was way up, even in the poorer and more urban areas, the voter turnout was higher. So it didn't seem like it was playing out, except in the fact that the people like Stacey Abrams didn't win. And maybe that's the thing is that, if somebody is hell-bent on keeping an election system the way it is, it's because they figured out how to game it?
Well, yeah, I think that's part of it. But the bottom line for Virginia in particular is our legislators need to understand that the kind of reforms that people want in the state, reforms that help make our voter registration list cleaner, that require a good ID for all those kind of things, are not going to suppress anyone's votes. In fact, they'll just simply make the votes of everybody safer.
Well, I think the number was less than 1,000 people when Bob McDonnell's administration put in the first Virginia voter ID requirement. They said, listen, we will make a free photo ID available to anyone that doesn't have it. And I don't believe that number even got to 1,000 of people who said, I don't have one, and applied and went to the DMV and got a free photo ID from the state that way. It's always a lie. It's always a shell game with these folks. Ranked choice voting, and again, it goes back to this idea. I think you mentioned the political consultant class is salivating over this. There's more, with more candidates means more consultants, which means more ad buys. And how is a political party that is so hell-bent about campaign finance reform as the American Democratic Party is, for a voting structure that's just going to lead to more TV ads being paid for by more political action committees saying, don't vote for so-and-so, make sure that this person's number one on your ballot to keep this person from being on the next ballot, and so on and so forth, because they seem to be like the only ones. I guess consultants get paid on the ad buys, so maybe that's why they're all for this.
Yeah, they are, and while publicly they always talk about campaign finance reform, that they're for this or that. Behind the scenes, they don't want that kind of thing to go through because they take advantage of the rules as they are. They make a tremendous amount of money doing it, and that is basically part of their propaganda war, the same way they've been engaged in this propaganda war about election reforms, claiming that it suppresses people's votes when in fact it doesn't. And part of what they're trying to do with those claims is scare their own constituents, scare their own voters, because they know that may get them more money and more contributions.
Hans, last one, and this is very, very obscure, but it's going through the General Assembly just like ranked choice voting is being debated. And it's a reform to how campaigns are financed in Virginia. And I know we're unusual in this, but I really ruminated on this a lot. And I find myself against anyone who says we need to reform Virginia's campaign finance rules to keep a candidate from using campaign contributions for personal expenses. And I thought about it for a long time, and all of a sudden it struck me that this is going to keep the average Joe or Joanne who didn't go to Hampton-Sydney College, didn't get into the right fraternity, hasn't been in the right law firm for his whole, young adult life, and now is going to run for House of Delegates and has a nice nest egg to fall back on. If Joe Pipefitter wants to run for city council, he's got to put his whole life on hold for that, and maybe there are some mortgage payments that need to be made. I think a reform like that, though it sounds like a lot of these things, they sound good on paper, is actually going to diminish the average person's ability to participate in the public square, even to a point of a school board race.
Well, you're absolutely right about that. And if you look at the history of federal campaign finance reforms over the last 30 years, that's exactly what it does. Reforms always hurt the average person who wants to run, the person who isn't a multi-millionaire, because they've got the money to finance themselves in a way that they don't need campaign funds to do. It's the average person who's not a multi-millionaire who gets hurt by those kind of restrictions.
But yet the Democrats are the ones who tell me they're for all voices. So you say one thing while you're saying there must be an English to politician translation book that I haven't found yet, Hans. Maybe we need to write one.
I think that's probably a good idea.
Yeah, English to politician, politician to English translation book. Hans von Spakovsky, it's heritage.org, the Meese Center there, but also the manager of the Election Integrity Law Reform Initiative with us at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. Hans, it's always great talking to you. I easily could call you every week, but I want some credit for restraint in that, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend.
Thanks. You too. Bye-bye.
Coming up next, certainly an issue that you may or may not have heard of. Have you heard of Zuckerbucks? Yes, Zuckerbucks, and we're going to talk with Hayden Ludwig, Senior Investigative Researcher with the Capital Research Center, on the latest on the new American majority and the origins of the Zuckerbuck.